Welcome to Refugee Assistance Partners New Jersey, or RAP. Thank you for your commitment to this organization. This training module will walk you through the specific policies of RAP, which will guide your work as a trustee or an employee and clarify how these policies underscore our mission. This video provides an audiovisual option to learn about RAP policies. Be sure to read the slides as you listen along to the narration. The full text of RAP's policy guide is in the Better Impact volunteer portal in the document library. The policies in this training module have been developed by the RAP Board of Trustees and reviewed by attorneys with pro bono partnership. Some are required by state or federal law, and all policies reflect the priorities of the organization. RAP policies are subject to periodic review to be sure we serve our clients and volunteers in the best way possible. Input regarding policy effectiveness can be given to the Executive Director or a trustee for consideration by the Board of Trustees. This training will include organization-wide general policies as well as policies specific to your role as a trustee or an employee. For this training's outcomes, we hope to build an understanding of the policies guiding us, to foster a climate of partnership and respect, and to hone our skills in applying ethical standards to our work. Learning about policies helps communicate and underscore RAP's code of ethics. We all work together as part of a RAP team to act within this code as a way to honor you, the clients we serve, and the organization. Let's review before we dive into some specific policies. Policies do three very important things. First, they set up rules to guide our behavior as representatives of the organization. Second, they clarify our expectations of volunteers, employees, and the board. And finally, policies underscore and amplify our organizational values and beliefs. What we believe as an organization informs the policies that we adopt. To review, our mission is to welcome refugees and help them on their path to self-sufficiency while respecting their dignity and uniqueness. The values we profess are welcome, collaboration, community, resilience, and respect. And our guiding principles are to consider culture, consider power, respect privacy and confidentiality, and manage expectations in our work with RAP. For board trustees specifically, we lead by example. Championing RAP's policies promotes ethical conduct throughout the organization and strengthens our mission. Following policy promotes transparency and accountability and preserves our institutional knowledge and history. So let's dive in by first looking at RAP's protection policies. RAP has two protection policies, a policy about the use of images and a child protection policy. The use of information and likenesses in media, audio, and visual recordings are powerful storytelling tools. When deciding what, when, and how to use information and likenesses, consider what possible effects sharing might have, and act in the best interest of the person being depicted. For some refugees, children, and other vulnerable people, negative consequences could be severe. Explain what the images will be used for and get client consent. Children and adults in very vulnerable situations might require special precautions to avoid disclosing names, locations, or other identifying contextual information. Perhaps you use a pseudonym. With any use of information, be truthful and respectful of the person's dignity, acting out of respect and compassion, not pity. Images should be used to educate and inspire action. The Protection in Children and Vulnerable Adults policy nurtures an environment where children and adults feel safe, listened to, respected, and valued. An adult is not assumed to be vulnerable just by being a refugee. We can start with that assumption, but it might not stay that way when we learn more. Children are always assumed to be vulnerable because of the inherent power imbalance and lack of knowledge. Note that children and vulnerable adults might include some RAP volunteers, so this policy is for all of RAP. RAP follows the two-adult rule. At least two adults should be present with a child. We prefer at least one adult be a child's family member or close friend if possible. One adult could be alone with a group of children. If the presence of a second adult is not practical or possible, one-on-one interactions must be public and observable. This two-adult rule also applies when driving clients in volunteers' personal vehicles, as referred to in the Code of Conduct section of the Policy Training for Volunteers, also available for your review in the Better Impact portal. RAP takes child abuse and exploitation very seriously. In general, if anyone suspects child abuse or exploitation, New Jersey state law requires them to report it to the authorities. The person reporting the suspected abuse informs their RAP team leader and the executive director or RAP trustee in that order. Then the executive director or the reporting person will call either the police or the state's child protective services. Please take time to read the full RAP policy in the Better Impact volunteer portal for detailed instructions on how to address this situation. In our experience, encountering possible child abuse is quite rare, but people should never be afraid to act in the best interest of a child. Use the full text of this policy to guide your steps. Remember, you are not alone. You are part of the RAP team. The next section briefly covers several internal policies pertinent to volunteers, trustees, and employees. Non-discrimination. RAP serves displaced families and individuals and welcomes volunteers, trustees, and employees equally, regardless of any personal characteristic listed here or otherwise protected by law. RAP also prohibits harassment based on any of these characteristics. Freedom from harassment. In a more general sense, RAP prohibits harassment for any reason. Harassment refers to behavior that is not welcome, that is personally offensive, or is offensive to a reasonable person, that debilitates morale. RAP does not tolerate harassment of employees, volunteers, or clients. If a person believes they have been or are being harassed, they should report this to the executive director without fear of retaliation. Termination. Finally, RAP reserves the right to terminate volunteers or employees who violate RAP's principles and policies upon review from the organization. Next, we'll look at our background check policy. Background checks are necessary for the safety of our clients as well as representatives of RAP. All volunteers, trustees, and employees are required to register in Better Impact, our volunteer portal. Most volunteers and all trustees and employees must also pass a background check. They must be renewed every 3 years in alignment with industry standards. Our contracted service provider is an industry leader and their checks are safe and secure to do. RAP only receives the results of the check, not any of the data. Volunteers can substitute a check from an independent source if their check's criminal searches match our requirements. Now let's cover RAP's reimbursement policy. RAP has 3 tiers of expenses. Volunteers can request reimbursement for up to $250 with approval from the executive director or treasurer. RAP's expenses in the second tier, $250 to $500, must be pre-approved by the executive director or treasurer and are usually incurred by RAP itself, not with reimbursements. Expenses in the highest tier must be pre-approved by the Treasurer or the Board's Executive Committee. All expenses must be reported to the Executive Director, who informs the Treasurer and the accounting services monthly for reporting, bookkeeping, and tax purposes. Expenses must be in alignment with organizational values and priorities. Expenses required by contract or expenses to fulfill specific budget commitments do not need approval since the contract and budget were previously approved by the Board. If there's a question about the merit of a possible expense or funding request, RAP has an evaluative tool to guide the Executive Director and Treasurer's decision-making process. Next, we'll cover RAP's whistleblower policy. The whistleblower policy guides volunteers, trustees, and employees on when and how to report wrongful conduct. These ethical violations should be reported as soon as possible and up-channeled to the board president. Every report will be investigated. The person reporting does not have to prove their case, but should show that they are acting in good faith. As long as they report in good faith and not maliciously, there will not be negative consequences. To that end, the identity of the person reporting is kept confidential, except for when the investigation requires it to be shared with those reviewing the case. Anonymous reporting is allowed, but might not be sufficient for the investigation. This section will review policies specific to the Board of Trustees and all employees. RAP is required by law to retain records specific to organizational structure and operation. See Annex A of the full text of this policy, which is posted in the Volunteer Portal's file library, to see a list of required documents. Annex A's list is not exhaustive. There may be other documents to retain that are core to our operation, such as the RAP timeline, trustee history, and others. The Treasurer retains financial and banking records as well, which might not be listed in Annex A, but are essential to RAP's financial sustainability. The Secretary and the Executive Director are responsible for compliance to this policy. Preservation of records is secure, and their destruction is permanent. To preserve a document safely, keep at least one print copy and at least one digital copy. For originating documents such as our 501c3 designation and our Articles of Incorporation, keep the original safe and retain multiple copies in two separate locations. Remember to also maintain an updated record of where the documents are stored, especially when there's a change in officers, so nothing is lost in the transition. To destroy a record, remember to do so with print and digital copies in accordance with data privacy laws. One additional note. As required by law, RAP retains two permanent copies of every set of board meeting minutes. This is a print copy and a digital copy. To ensure confidentiality and data security, digital recordings of board meetings should be deleted 1 month after the minutes have been filed. Finally, there will be no record destruction or erasure for print or digital records in the event of an anticipated, pending, or actual document request, lawsuit, or investigation. Members of the Board of Trustees might have personal connections or interests that could conflict with their responsibilities as a trustee. The trustees will declare their possible conflicts of interest at the beginning of each program year. A perceived or actual conflict might occur if the actions or dealings between RAP and a trustee or the related party might result in personal gain for that trustee. A conflict might also occur if a trustee serves or otherwise aids an organization which competes with RAP. Our gift acceptance policy governs donations, gifts, and other material and financial support for the organization. While gifts fuel our purpose, the mission always comes first. Our mission is what guides, focuses, and drives all of our actions. Remember that RAP's success in getting sustained support is a direct result of its clear purpose and strong mission rather than the other way around. The Resource Development Committee manages gifts to the organization in collaboration with the Treasurer. Gifts must further the mission of RAP. Any gift that is not appropriate for our mission or which presents inappropriate restrictions or burdens will be respectfully declined. The Resource Development Chair and the Treasurer work together for IRS reporting and for RAP's accounting procedures, which includes issuing a receipt and a thank you to donors. Donor information remains confidential unless the donor asks to be named. The full written text of this policy describes the guidelines for types of acceptable gifts. The last policy we'll go over is about restrictions to political campaigning and lobbying. There's an important distinction between advocacy and lobbying. Advocacy includes activities which influence public opinion and public policy. By contrast, lobbying is designed to influence specific legislation or political campaigns. Advocacy is a key component to advancing our mission. We must be continually and consistently vocal about standing up for the rights of the people we serve. However, as a 501c3 charitable organization, RAP must not engage in political campaigning or lobbying for specific legislation. If any trustee or employee engages in political or lobbying activities, it must be clear that they're doing so as an individual, not as a representative of RAP. Let's wrap up with a very quick summary. In this training, we reviewed RAP's mission and values, explained protection policies and other internal policies, and clarified background checks, reimbursements, and our whistleblower policy. We also explored several policies specific to your role on RAP's Board of Trustees or as an employee. Thank you for completing this policy training for trustees and employees. Remember to agree to the attestation at the end to fulfill this training qualification. Thank you for your commitment to RAP.